Okay. Righty. Let's get to it. Welcome everybody to Peace Action of Staten Island.
No.
We are having a forum
No,
tonight, and we
I'm
are
on-
calling it Stop the War in Ukraine. Peace Action of Staten Island wants to see a peaceful end to the war in Ukraine, and that's the reason we are hosting this forum tonight. We have brought together speakers who will give you firsthand accounts, the benefit of their experience and their knowledge, and hopefully this will help us to have an enlightened conversation. Before I introduce Emily Rubino, who will be our moderator, and will introduce the speakers, I just want to take care of some business first. Shortly, we will be sending out renewal notices for membership, and we certainly hope anyone who is on the call who is a member that you will consider staying with us. Your dues help us to continue our work, and also it helps us to support other people in our community who are working for peace and justice in this crazy world. Also, every year, Peace Action of Staten Island has a Make Food Not War event, and we honor people again from the community who are involved in working for peace and justice. And this year, we're going to do something a little different. In 2010, a gentleman by the name of Pete Napoleon and some of his friends, they started an annual picnic. They called it the Indigenous Peoples Day picnic. And we will be co-hosting with them this year. The date is October 10th. We will be sending out information. It's going to be a barbecue. And we will be honoring again people from the community. So we hope that you will support us and come out and have a wonderful time. It's a great event. This picnic has been going on since 2010. And I think there was at least probably 2 years where they couldn't do it because of COVID. But there's usually a wonderful response and everybody has a great time. And it's wonderful to get back out in the community and let people see our faces and to work together. That's always so very, very important. So let's get on to our forum this evening. We are very excited to have as our moderator, Emily Rubino, who is the Executive Director of Peace Action of New York State. She is an International Peace Bureau Council member and a Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security board member. She is dedicated to intersectional activism and recognizes the connections between domestic social justice struggles and international human rights struggles. She looks forward to continuing this work for a less aggressive world order. She graduated from Fordham University with a BA in International Humanitarian Affairs and Sociology. And I also at this time want to thank the working group they worked tirelessly and so hard to put this forum together tonight between, research and meetings and, gathering information and getting speakers to come. So they really deserve our heartfelt thanks for all the hard work that they did. And to the board, as always, for all your support. Tonight, you might hear things that you don't agree with, that, that's fine. We can all agree to disagree respectfully. And I trust that everyone here will honor that. So without further ado, it is my pleasure, it's my honor to introduce Emily Rubino, who's going to introduce the speakers. Emily, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Eileen, and thank you to Peace Action Staten Island for having me tonight and asking me to moderate. I'm excited for us to have this conversation. And we've got three really incredible speakers with us here tonight. We've got Mark Diono, we've got Paul J, and we've got Jerry Salak. I'm going to introduce each of them right before they speak, and each speaker will be presenting for 8 to 10 minutes. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to Q&A after the initial presentations. So up first, we've got Mark. Mark Diono, author and journalist, has spent about 4 months of the 7-month Russian invasion in Ukraine in either Poland helping with the refugee crisis, or in Ukraine delivering humanitarian aid and military supplies. He's a US Navy veteran and a self-described strong believer in democratic freedoms. Mark Diono was a 2013 Pulitzer Prize finalist in news commentary for the Star Ledger, which is New Jersey's largest newspaper. And I'd like to give the floor to Mark. And I know Sally will be sharing her screen with some photos that Mark has requested that we share.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you all for inviting me to this forum. I want to start by saying that I was a Cold War veteran, basically, and in 1975, when I was a Navy corpsman, we used to have classes on Russian strength. And in those classes, we basically learned from other people, you know, that taught classes about our strength versus Russia's strength, was that Russia was a paper tiger. This is 1975. And that their strength was overstated by our military for the purpose of fueling our military industrial complex. That the more we could create Russia as a boogeyman for the world, the more weapons we would sell. Everybody was afraid of Russia. And so you could sell them all this stuff. But we also learned that of the X amount of nuclear submarines they had, you know, more than half didn't work, that they were using outdated technology in 1975. When the Soviet Union broke up in 1990, 91, it's gone nowhere but downhill since. It's an underproductive, underpopulated, largely impoverished country in many places, and its population base is in an area that's half the size of Ukraine. And so with that in mind, when Putin amassed that 40-mile convoy outside of Kyiv with the intention of invading, I was hoping that Western leaders would draw a line in the sand. This is the moment that we feared and prepared for 75 years, when Russia would invade a democratic, westernized European nation. This is why NATO was formed. This is why we spent trillions of dollars on all this weaponry. And the failure to act decisively at that point and promising the American people that we would not militarily intervene, promising the world we would not militarily intervene, I believe gave Putin the green light to invade Kyiv. And I believe in my heart that if the Western leaders talked about responding in kind, that he would have found a backdoor out and back down like the Soviet Union usually does, historically. And so to me, this war is a tragic case of failed leadership by the West. The death and destruction in Ukraine has been completely, to me, unnecessary. That there could have been a resolution of this war by threatening to meet force with force. And if we haven't learned by now, you know, with the Stalins and the Hitlers and the Putins of the world, that you can't negotiate with force. You can only meet force with force. If we haven't learned that now, that they continue their domination and domino effect of moving forward. And Putin came right out and said it. He came out and said he wanted to restore the Soviet Union. And the people in Poland and other Eastern European countries are terrified of that. And they are very serious about defending their freedoms. And while I was in Poland, the Polish army was amassing on the Eastern Front and the Belarusian front. I saw that with my own two eyes. I think we failed those Eastern European nations by not backing them immediately and not creating a scenario where Putin was forced to confront the full might of NATO if he decided to go to Kyiv. Now, I want to say also even though I'm a military veteran, I was against the war in Iraq. I was against the war in Afghanistan. I can't tell you how many soldiers' funerals I went to as a journalist. As a Navy corpsman post-Vietnam, I saw with my own two eyes the residual effects of war, the missing limbs. I was in the amputee center for the East Coast in Philadelphia. We also had a Section 8 ward with the people that were war-torn, shell-shocked, PTSD. I covered PTSD issues as a journalist, plenty of it, when it became a big issue, and our Veterans Administration began to treat these guys with drugs and failed them in so many ways. And then when they became addicted to drugs, they took the drugs with them. So I'm not a pro-war guy, but at the same time, when Russia oversteps to a point like this, and the saber-rattling of nuclear proliferation makes everyone back down, it gave him the green light to really create a murderous, brutal situation over there that actually continues today. I was in villages where they said, where I saw the Russians didn't occupy those places because there was nothing left to occupy. They blew up everything. They blew up farmhouses. They killed innocent people. I think that's something that, as I said before, could have been avoided with some strong leadership. So up on the screen now are some pictures of where I was. This was a remote camp near the Belarusian border, where you can see the condition of the Ukrainian military. These guys are fearless, they're brave, they're working with outdated equipment. In the beginning of the war, they didn't have any support, and they drove Russia out of Kyiv after 8 or 9 weeks of occupation and destruction. So that's really all I have to say. Maybe we'll go through some of the pictures later, but at the risk of repeating myself, I do feel this was an avoidable war, and that if we are for peace, there comes a time in the pursuit of peace where you have to threaten war, and we did not do that in a timely manner.
Great, thank you, Mark. I'm not sure if you want to comment any more on these photos right now, or if you.
Well, I think the destruction pictures and the condition of the Army speaks for itself. You know, when these guys are rotating out of the front, they're not being served. They live in a very primitive environment. This picture is of women all over the country. There are people who spend every hour they can making camouflage for the Army, and I think it really speaks to the unity of the country and the desire of these people to be free. I transported a woman from a place that was 10 kilometers from Russia, and the Russians promised her safe passage to Russia, and she traveled with her mother, a teenage daughter, and a toddler, or a younger child, 580 miles to get to the freedom of Poland. That last picture is one of my favorite pictures from my time there. There's a woman working in the window up there that you can barely see, with a cannonball blast in her house. And I think this really speaks to the courage of these people and their desire to win this war. I transported 30 families from the Polish border to deeper into Poland, and they were going to win the war and go home. And this was March. This was in the very beginning of the invasion. This is also one of my favorite events, pictures. This became actually, I think I'm the first person who actually wrote about this. And in the recent Independence Day celebration, it became better known. But the Ukrainians take all the bombed and destroyed Russian vehicles, and they display them in the centers of Kyiv, and people climb all over them. They celebrate this. I mean, again, it speaks to how much they hate the Russians, love their freedom. You know, and children are playing on these things like they're a playground. And we can talk more about that as the night goes on.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing and for providing the photos as well. Great. So our next speaker is Paul Jay. Paul Jay is a journalist and filmmaker. He's the founder and host of the Analysis.News, which is a video and audio current affairs interview and commentary show and website. And Jay was also the co-creator and co-executive producer of Face Off and Counterspin, nightly primetime debate programs that ran for 10 years on CBC News World. So welcome, Paul. I give you the mic.
Thanks for the invitation. Sound and everything is okay? Yeah. Well, first of all, I agree entirely with Mark, at least on one thing. This was an entirely unnecessary war. I don't think we come to the conclusion in the same way, but that I agree with. I don't think one can be so sure that rolling the dice, that this direct U.S.-NATO military confrontation with Russia would not have led to a serious all-out war, which necessarily would have gone to some kind of tactical nuclear weapons. Because if it became that kind of war, Russia would not have stood very long against NATO and American troops. You can see they're not doing all that well against fairly well-armed Ukrainian troops. I'm quite preoccupied with this issue of the threat of nuclear war. What I'm mostly doing these days is I'm working with Dan Ellsberg on a documentary film based on his book, Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And in the film, I also have interviews with people like Larry Wilkerson, Chomsky's and others. And all the people who I have talked to, including Russians who are anti-war Russians, do not discount that Putin's position leading up to this war and now is precarious. And that's the reason the war began, really. I interviewed a guy named Boris Kargalitsky. I buy his analysis, which is the Russian people were fed up with the Russian oligarchy, and they were fed up with what was happening to their living standards. Outside of a couple of cities, most of Russia is very poor, as Mark said. And they were fed up with Putin. And there's nothing like a good war. And he certainly could learn that from the United States. There's nothing like a good war to be a wartime president. That's how you, for some damn reason, gain popularity in the United States. And so far, to a large extent, it's worked in Russia. It certainly worked with Chechnya. So dealing with a class and a clique around Putin, he's not all by himself here. There's a whole bureaucracy and apparatchik. There's the sections of the military intelligence. The nationalist religious fervor that supports that rule, and I have to say, not so dissimilar from a nationalist and to a large extent religious fervor in the United States and some other countries. But it depends on a kind of narrative I would not want to throw a nuclear dice with. that they would that kind of humiliation of having to back down in the face of a serious NATO direct commitment, and or losing to it, which almost surely they would have if it had become such a direct fight. But I think one needs to back up a few steps here, because if you know, where do you start the analysis? So let me just back up to a big picture. We're dealing, if you just want to talk about the three main involved countries here, meaning Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, and then of course the NATO countries of Europe and so on. These are all class societies. We all know that. These are all, you know, US, Russia, Ukraine, these are all oligarchies. These are all ruled by states that represent classes who don't give a damn about any democracy, don't give a damn about their own people, never mind any other people. And they don't fight wars to liberate anybody. And the United States really never has. Certainly, I mean, you can get into more complicated things about World War II, but certainly since World War II, the United States does not fight in the interest of other people, and it doesn't even fight in the interest of its own people. It fights, you know, Mark was talking about selling arms. Well, yeah, that's one of the main motivators: geopolitical power, world hegemony, and so on. So let's back up. And let's also include that while there is not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that this was an unprovoked aggression by Russia, there was no imminent threat to Russia. That's the only bar there is for invading another country in terms of international law. There's only one bar. Is there an imminent threat? And there was no imminent threat to Russia. I don't buy that there was an imminent threat to Donbass. I just don't see the evidence for it. And I don't know if there's anyone on this panel that's going to argue a kind of more understanding role for Russia. And if they are, we can talk more about that. But I've looked at the observer missions from the OSCE, the number of people that were killed in Donbass from 2018 to 2021. This does seem to be unprovoked. I don't buy that the NATO expansion is a justification for Russian invasion. I don't think there was any real chance of Ukraine joining NATO. France, Germany, Turkey. I mean, I can't believe they would ever get consensus, which they need, for Ukraine to join NATO. And there's already NATO countries on Russia's border. I mean, you know, if they want to throw NATO missiles into Moscow, do it from Estonia. You don't need Ukraine to do it. So I don't buy any of the Russian arguments about why this invasion took place. But that said, the Russian oligarchs, the Ukrainian oligarchs, who are every bit as corrupt and self-serving as the Russian and American oligarchs, could have avoided this, perhaps. It depends. It might have. But I think if you want to say, number one, Ukraine could have, before the invasion, simply acknowledged what Zelensky actually for a few weeks did acknowledge, is that NATO wasn't going to let Ukraine in. So why not say so? Why not just say, okay, we're really never getting in anyway, we're going to withdraw our application to be in NATO, and at least take it off the table. Whether that would have made the difference or not, it would certainly have made a difference in terms of Russian public opinion and their appreciation of this. I mean, 75 million Americans voted for Donald Trump because they get siloed media information. Well, the majority of Russians get siloed media information. And the majority of Russians saw NATO as a threat. I don't believe it really was, but they thought so. The majority of Russians, at least until recently, believed there was a real threat of genocide against Donbass. I don't think there was any evidence to say that was true, but a lot of people thought so. So if the Ukrainian government had taken NATO off the table, and the American government could have taken off NATO off the table. Yeah, sure, you can say, oh, it's up to Ukraine, it's their right to join. Fine. But you got to vote whether you're going to let them in or not. So the United States could have said, well, you know what, we're not going to vote to let Ukraine in because it's not good for the world. Now, I can't say for sure that would have made the difference, but it might have made a difference in terms of Russian public opinion, and maybe it would have given Putin a little bit of way to save face. I mean, we're speculating a lot of what ifs here because we don't know for sure, but I would think those were principled positions to take NATO off the table. The fundamental thing here is that this doesn't take place in a vacuum. That the history of this struggle doesn't start from the invasion. It doesn't start from 2014. It starts in the context of a system of global monopoly capitalism, and within that system, there's a lot of things that play here. Number one, the American, since World War II, desire and to a large extent accomplished of global hegemony. And global hegemony means you have to be the hegemon in every region. So if you're not, if there's any region that you don't feel you're the top dog in, you're no longer the global hegemon. And so after the fall of the Soviet Union, there's a time there where during the chaos of the 1990s, where the former party apparatchiks and others loot the Soviet publicly owned economy, and to a large extent with American and Western facilitation and encouragement. Although I never want to, in anything am I going to say that I think the Americans control this situation. These are fundamentally domestic, internal phenomena, but of course they take place in the context of a global capitalist system with the Americans as the dominant player here. But out of the chaos of the 90s, you have the emergence of a Russian state that's necessary to have some orderly capitalism. On behalf of the oligarchs, but still some kind of rules-based, orderly system. And if the U.S. and the Western Europe had allowed Russia in those earlier times, late 90s, early 2000s, to develop in a way that they were allowed to take their place within this kind of vision Gorbachev had, and even Putin talked about this in the early period, as essentially being part of Western European capitalism. But no, the U.S. and Germany, particularly those two, and England, they didn't want Russia to take that place because Russia has all the capacity. They're this fossil fuel lopsided economy. But in terms of the size of population, the natural resources, the educated people, the ability to develop a more advanced industrial base, Russia would have been a really serious competitor for Germany and Europe, but not one that was willing to come under the American umbrella. The whole culture and history of Russia, and as I said earlier, this nationalist/religious fervor and culture that's the basis of the ideological defense of the Russian state, they wouldn't have been a subordinate to the U.S. the way Germany, for obvious reasons, has been, at least so far. But if they had done that, if the West had found a way to include Russia, now this isn't a morality play. It's the way capitalism works. This isn't good guys, bad guys. Oh, the Americans were bad guys, good guys. Capitalism is about monopoly. that's its very essence. Monopolies compete. Monopolies domestically compete. Capitalist states compete even U.S. and Germany compete. You could see even over that submarine sale to Australia, the way they fought over France versus England and the U.S. I mean, the contradictions between the capitalists are very severe. And of course, most severe is when you have a power like Russia that feels hemmed in. So the solution, it would have been, if actually the United States really cared about democracy, really, to encourage the legitimately democratic forces in Russia, not just the pro-American ones, but they didn't. So there's no good players in this whole sphere. Now, that said, that doesn't take away from the fact that the Russian aggression is a naked, unprovoked aggression. So in this kind of narrow time frame, you have to deal with, you can't ignore it, because tens of thousands of people are being killed. And this is a barbaric attack on the Ukrainian people. So you got to balance this problem of all the oligarchs involved in this, including the Ukrainian oligarchs. I can't prove what I'm about to say, but I believe it to be true, which is they didn't mind all this shit hitting the fan because the billions of dollars that are coming in, it's hard to believe the Ukrainian oligarchs aren't finding a way to get a taste, the way the mafia used to talk about. They're getting a cut of this kind of money that's coming in. And of course, the American military industrial complex adores this. Where is all these billions of dollars going to buy arms, mostly from American arms manufacturing? So it's a very complex problem, but it does reduce itself to a demand by progressive people that Russia should stop the aggression. I mean, that's clear cut. They should get back to February 23rd borders. I don't agree that Ukraine should continue this fight to expel Russia from Donbass, to expel from Crimea, because tens of thousands more people are going to get killed. And I really believe that anyone that can justify such a slaughter under any rubric, any labels, any analysis, there's a bit of sociopathy there. That doesn't mean the Ukrainian people don't have a right to fight to defend themselves against this aggression. But there needs to be a demand from progressive people everywhere that, yeah, the war's got to stop. And I would condition, or attempt to condition in any way, any military support for Ukraine, use it as some kind of leverage against Russia to say, look, this support is going to come, but there's a way for it not to come, and try to use it to force some kind of negotiations. Because I mean, I don't know how if this really ends with a serious defeat, even in Donbass for the Russians and Crimea, I don't think Putin lasts. But I don't think you get the anti-war anti-Putin next. You're more likely to get an outright Hitler next. You're more likely to get an even more aggressive next. Because most of the military intelligence and the Russian Orthodox Church and the supposed Communist Party, which is even more rabidly nationalist and fascistic than perhaps even Putin is, these people might be the ones that come to power. And these people are seriously talking about tactical nuclear weapons. And we shouldn't roll the dice on that. Yeah, sure, I can stop here.
Great, cool, thank you. We can delve into that further. Just a reminder for those in the chat to use the chat for respectful discussion and for questions for our speakers that we'll get to at the end. And thank you, Paul, for your comments. Next up, we've got Jerry Salak. Jerry has been an organizer against imperialist wars and racism since the 1960s. He taught US history to high school students. And he was in Ukraine in 2014 and speaks Ukrainian. So thanks for joining us, Jerry, and I hand it over to you now.
Thanks. I'll try to be succinct. So I think that Right now, the world is racked by conflict between these major imperialist powers, with the U.S., I think, as a falling imperialist power, weakening, China rising, and Russia resurgent. And these conflicts between these powers, I think, are evident in every part of the world. And right now, mainly in Ukraine, but they were also in the Middle East, especially in Yemen, in various, parts of the world. So I think right now, Ukraine is like a pawn in this conflict of imperialist powers. And that's been going on for a while. I mean, in Ukraine, it's been a back and forth between pro-Russian governments and pro-Ukrainian governments. And it came to a head with what they call the Euromaidan in 2014, where, the Yanukovych, who was, mainly pro-Russian, even though all these Ukrainian governments have tried to straddle the line there between, Russia on the one side and mainly the United States on the other side. I mean, they say NATO and they say the European Union, but it's really the United States. And even in terms of military aid, that's mainly coming from the United States. Anyway, so there was this coup. Yanukovych was ousted. He was not ousted by an election. He was ousted by uprising that was to a large extent supported by the U.S. I mean, one of the groups leading this uprising was a neo-Nazi group called Svoboda, and John McCain and another U.S. senator went to visit, and McCain had dinner with leaders of Svoboda, went to one of these Svoboda rallies. Victoria Nuland, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, was heard talking about what kind of government. There was a phone call that was intercepted. So this Euromaidan more or less put the U.S. in a dominant position in Ukraine. And what happened was that the Russians reacted against that. They took over Ukraine and they took over the Donbass, the Crimea, Ukraine, and the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass, which, by the way, is an industrialized and very important area economically. But at the same time that the Ukrainians, when they lost these two parts, they started rearming and reigniting, their military, mainly with the help of the United States. And one of the key elements of that, and this is, where Putin sort of gets his, calling the, Ukrainians, pro-Nazi, is this Azov Battalion, which was, started by these neo-Nazis. The Ukrainians at that point, anybody that formed the battalion could join and become part of the Ukrainian National Guard and eventually become part of the Ukrainian army. And the Azov Battalion has clear, Nazi roots. They were actually funded by one of these Ukrainian billionaires, which, people call them oligarchs, but what they are is, just like billionaires anywhere in the world. The Azov Battalion was funded by this guy called Amoysky, who was a billionaire from the eastern part of Ukraine. He was a governor of either Donetsk or Luhansk, I forget which one. And he also funded IDAR, Dnipro 1, Dnipro 2, other very nationalistic pro-Nazi battalions. And they eventually became part of the Ukrainian army. And they actually, Azov Battalion started a training center in Ukraine, in Kiev, where these right-wing, for over 50 countries came to be trained. Now, Zelensky, so that, you know, after this Euromaidan, this guy Poroshenko was the chocolate king. He was another freaking billionaire. And part of the problem in Ukraine historically has been corruption. So not only did, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, did they introduce capitalism in Ukraine like they did in Russia, but it was a particularly corrupt form. So one of the continual sort of, and one of the reasons why Ukraine was not allowed to join the European Union and even NATO is because of this corruption. So Poroshenko came in and he was as corrupt as all the previous guys, as Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian guy. And then Zelensky won this election, 2019, I think. And Zelensky came from this media empire. Guess who owned the media empire? Kolomoisky, the same guy that had funded the Azov Battalion, these other pro-Nazi battalions. So, and when Zelensky came into power, he was equally corrupt. I mean, he appointed Kolomoisky's people to various government positions. He kicked out any people that were not with him. And then these papers came out, the Pandora Papers or Panama Papers, saying he had all these offshore accounts with millions of dollars. And Zelensky, before this war, had a rating of around a positive rating in Ukraine of about 30%. He didn't do anything for the people of Ukraine. He was, promoting another set of billionaires. So now, and actually this Azov Battalion and these other battalions were all incorporated into the Ukrainian army. Now, so the war, and I do, in other words, part of this back and forth battle over who would run Ukraine between the US imperialists and the Russian imperialists did involve NATO, which, I mean, there are now missiles aimed at Russia and these countries that border the US. I mean, I was reading an article from Progressive or Politico or one of these places. Imagine if the Russians, who have these hypersonic missiles by now, they're kind of advanced. Their military has a lot of features that are actually more advanced than what the US has, particularly in terms of nukes and missiles and stuff. So this idea that this war in Ukraine could start becoming a nuclear conflict is not a far-fetched idea, because eventually these imperialist powers, as they try to redivide the world, I think they will come into war with each other, which would be a world war. So, I mean, already the Chinese are taking lessons from what the Russians' strengths and weaknesses in trying to take over Ukraine and how they want to take over Taiwan, right? So in other words, this inter-imperialist rivalry, that it's a worldwide rivalry that will be, I think, finally resolved by world war. And so what is the answer to that? And I would say the answer to that is what I always, told my students when I was teaching, that we'd have a better world if they ran it than who runs it now. When regular people, run the world, we have to get rid of all these capitalists around the world. I just wanted to say one thing, because there is this, like, what's happening in Ukraine right now is terrible, but there's many parts of the world that what's happening is much, much worse. In other words, if you go back to the Clinton administration between Iraq I war and Iraq War #2, according to the United Nations, U.S. sanctions and bombing led to 500,000 women and children being killed. The Vietnam War, 2 million civilians were killed. The Iraq wars themselves, tens of thousands. Right now in Yemen, tens of thousands. I mean, what's happening in Yemen now is much worse than what's happening in Ukraine. So I think that, imperialists or capitalists, as Paul referred to them, not only they run the world, but they're redividing the world now. And Ukraine is a victim of this struggle between falling U.S., which is, by the way, has very little support. Even the Europeans right now, their support for Ukraine is mild. Mostly it's all U.S. weaponry and U.S. support. And large parts of the world, from Africa to South America, are not supporting U.S. sanctions or any other part of that. So it's a bad situation, and I think it's made worse just last by nationalism. I think that when I hear we, I don't think of the U.S. government. I think of workers around the world. To me, that's what we is. And so I think when you think in these terms, nationalistic terms, you're going to think, we have to go and fight this war for so-called our country. And these wars, these billionaires in Ukraine are not dying in this war. It's regular working people that are dying. So anyway, that's it from me.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you to all three of our panelists for their opening remarks. If anyone has any questions, we can open it up to Q&A. Just put them in the chat and I'll be selecting a few. But to just get us started, I think there's a wide range of views from our panelists on how we got into this war, maybe how we should have initially responded. But I'm really curious to hear from each of our panelists how they think we go about ending this. What do you think the most realistic way of us backing away from that nuclear escalation and finally ending this war is? And maybe we'll go in the initial speaking order. So Mark, if you'd like to answer first.
Well, first, I'd like to address a couple of the points made. The history of tension between Russia and Ukraine is hundreds and hundreds of years old. The czars, the Soviets took over the country. Ukraine is the first member of the Soviet Union that were brought into the Soviet Union in 1921. Kyiv was invaded by the Russians, the Red Army, 100 years ago. The Ukrainians believe that Kyiv is actually the center of, Eastern European, Rus, intellect, art, everything, religion, and that Russia is actually, sort of the bastard state. So this idea that this conflict, can be looked at in modern terminology only, I think that Paul and Jerry are right that the nationalism is a huge part of that, but that nationalism, it starts with when the kings and queens were in charge. It's not a new thing, and so the tensions between these countries, which are so intertwined, also much of Ukraine speaks Russian. And certainly the kids the people that are now, contemporaries, 60s and 50s that were in grammar school in Ukraine were taught Russian, when the Soviet Union ran the country. So this idea of identity, this clash of identity between these two countries it's an entangled ancient thing. That said, I wanted to also address the 1991 Buddhist memorandum when, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons under the promise that Russia would never invade them, and that the United States gave assurances that they would be defended if they were. And so, I know these treaties are not worth the paper that they're written on, and certainly the Polish people know that better than anybody. But I do think that when you look at the whole geopolitical stuff and capitalism and workers and all that, it doesn't help the people who are getting bombs dropped on their heads right now. That's the issue to me. The grand scheme and the big global picture, yeah, that's concerning, obviously. But that doesn't help the guy who's who's got a tank outside of his house and his farmhouse is being blown up by basically a bunch of vandals, who have weapons from an invading country. So the question is, in the short term, to me, what do you do? What do you do? And I believe that when you put all the geopolitics aside, there's a lot of wiggle room in there about imperialistic governments and all that. A sovereign nation has a right to decide how they want to live. And another country just can't come along and say, we want that part of you, and we want that part of you, and we're going to take this piece, we're going to take that piece. It's against any kind of international peaceful behavior to do that. And so what do you do in the immediate? And I believe that Ukrainians voted for a government, they voted for a way of life, and they're entitled to that. They're entitled to their country. And whether they're protected by NATO or not is almost irrelevant in this point, because they are, Russia is invading them. I'll go back to something Paul said. Putin is struggling. And I think that, going back to my first point, he would have accomplished the same thing that he wants to accomplish by invading Ukraine if he pulled out. Everybody's against us. We're the victims here. The West, they're the bad guys. So you have to back my regime because that's how we're going to survive. Even if they were dealt a humiliating defeat, that he would have accomplished that galvanization of his country through the propaganda. Part of me thinks that Putin was actually hoping that NATO would step to the plate so that he could say, oh, see what they do to us, we're victims again. I think Germany and France are lukewarm about helping Ukraine because they're afraid of the Warsaw-Kyiv access of capitalism and the advances that these countries are making so rapidly. I mean, these are first-rate, first-world cities. I was shocked when I went to Warsaw. I brought families in, I'm like, my God, look at this place, the skyline, everything's new, international corporations, clean. You can say what you want about Ukrainians and their corruption and all that, but 750,000 displaced people are in Kyiv right now, with their homes destroyed, where they've lost everything. Not one of them's on the street. You don't see any bums. You don't see many homeless people. The subways are clean and they don't smell like urine. I asked a woman from the UN, where are all the people? She says they've been absorbed in the community. That's pretty amazing. 750,000 people. And I met them. They lived in my apartment complex. These old people from Donbass that were taken in by young couples and things like that. The Ukrainian agricultural production has gone up 10 times since the Soviet Union collapsed. 10 times per hectare acre. They're a huge industrial agricultural nation. They have the second most black soil in the world after us. They have the second most farmable land in the world after the United States. They're entitled to that. They're entitled to their success. Their tech industry is booming. They're a major tech center of Europe. To the capitalist dream. And I think that that's sort of the approach that, we have to take as a civilized world. How do you just let somebody do this to people without intervening? And maybe you can't stop human nature. I laugh when people say that climate change is gonna kill the planet, and I say it's not gonna kill the planet; it's gonna kill us. The planet will be fine. Maybe it'll even be better off once we're all dead. But I think that human nature, this sort of tribalism that is built into our DNA. How do you stop that? How do you stop that? All you can do is react in the immediate and put, I understand the world. I'm not naive. I know money comes first, politics is second, and humanity's in the basement. But at some point, politics and economy aside, we have to protect humanity. And somebody has to flex that muscle. And the United States of America, is the country that has the ability to do that in these situations. And we get embroiled in these places all over the world. And for the people that say, well, it's imperialistic and all this other stuff. Well, what happens if we withdraw? And we become isolationists, and we say, the hell with those guys. Let them figure it out. The butchery in the world, the savagery in the world, I think would increase, by trifold, because it's human nature. There's tribal wars in Africa. There's ethnic wars in Europe. It's just, it's basically hopeless in that regard. And I don't even think it's a class thing as much as just this inherent, tribalism of we want to be surrounded by people like us. And if they go to church on a different day, or if those guys wear their cloak differently, they become an enemy. And that's the history of mankind. And if you know how to overcome that, I'm all ears, because I don't.
I'm not sure how either, Mark, but thank you for those responses. I'll turn the mic over to Paul now.
Well, there's a lot of big questions come out of that. Well, I hope Mark's wrong. I think if he was right, we probably wouldn't be here now. I think nuclear war probably would have taken place already. But to answer the question, what can end the war now, if that's what the question was? Well, first of all, what the Ukrainians do has to be up to the Ukrainians, so they're going to decide. And at the moment, I think it's pretty clear the Ukrainians want to keep fighting. I personally actually don't agree with it, but it ain't up to me. I think what an agreement would look like, and probably in the end will be, so I don't know why so many people have to get killed to get there, is to get back to February 23rd lines and have legitimate referendum in Donbass. I think Donbass has a right to self-determination. I don't know whether they want to be part of Russia. Initially, when those areas separated to become autonomous in 2014, they were, if I understand correctly, very progressive and really were against this takeover, which I don't think 2014 was all about the right wing taking down a pro-Russian, but I think the right wing did hijack the spontaneous opposition to that government and installed a pro-American government. And in Donetsk and Lugansk, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I usually butcher the names, they resisted being part of this right-wing takeover. But from what I understand from people like Boris Kargalitsky, who was in Donbass during that time and supported the separation, what they wanted, first of all, was a federalist solution. They weren't trying to join Russia by any means. And they wanted a much more progressive politics. But Boris tells me, and he knows the things, I think, the situation very well, the progressives have lost in Donbass. And the people that run the areas now are really simply an extension of Russian power. But still, I don't know what the people of Donbass want, and that should be the determining factor. Do they want independence? Do they want to be have a different relationship to Ukraine? Do they want to be part of Russia? And the people of Donbass, in a legitimate and uncoerced referendum, should have a right to choose how they want to be. The same thing goes for Crimea. Although I think, it may be dubious about the referendum that took place in Crimea. There's been all kinds of polling of Crimea, including by Western polling firms. And it seems that the Crimea joining Russia and the current situation is quite popular, or at least was. Whether it still is, given what's happened since the invasion, I don't know. I mean, one of the ironic, crazy situations is that I'm told the majority of the Ukrainian army speaks Russian, and much of the Russian attacks are taking place against Russian-speaking people. So this, it's not like Russia's simply trying to defend Russian culture in Ukraine. That isn't what's happening. But it's not up. I can't tell Ukrainians what to do. We can't tell Russians what to do. And we can barely tell the American state what to do. But as progressives, we can try to articulate what the American state should do. I'm also in Canada, but I'm dual citizen, so now I'll put on my American hat. What should they do? They should do everything it takes to get peace negotiations going, to condition the support, military support, on getting negotiations going, and get back to February 23rd lines, and not encourage Ukraine to fight to the last Ukrainian. I have to take issue with something Mark said. United States is the worst war criminal since World War II. There's nothing, the only thing that compares to the United States, other than, Hitlerite Germany, is the British Empire, which killed something like 1.5 billion people over 300 years. We are not talking about people that give a damn about other people. They don't fight for democracy. And if the United States ever intervened in Ukraine, it would be a bloodbath of the most horrible proportions. There'd be no Ukraine left afterwards. And the Americans don't give a shit because they'll make money rebuilding Ukraine afterwards. These are the mentality of the military-industrial complex and much of the American elites is fascist. They didn't give a shit about how many people were killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. They are thoroughgoing racist. They don't even see these people as human. So to think that the U.S. direct involvement leads to anything good, I don't see it. That said, as progressives, I think U.S. policy should be get back to February 23rd borders, use the threat, if you want, of further military support for Ukraine as leverage to get the negotiations going. And then it will be up to the Ukrainians. They may decide, well, they don't give a shit what the Americans are saying. They're going to keep fighting. And it is their right. I mean, I agree with Mark on that. It's their right to expel the Russians. But as I said in the very beginning, this is a class question. And if all you do is turn Ukraine back to the Ukrainian oligarchs, if that's the Ukraine you end up with at the end of all this, then tens of thousands of people died for what?
Thank you, Paul, for that. Jerry?
Okay, so let me just say a few quick things, and then maybe we can have some discussion. So I remember reading a while ago that this fact, and so I went to double check it earlier today, and Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe. It's not even, there's no other country that is as poor as Ukraine. And Zelensky's, that's why, one reason why Zelensky's popularity rating was so low before this war. And then since then, over the bodies of many dead Ukrainians and Russians, all, you know, working class guys, I'm sure, well, I guess that they might have killed some Russian generals, which would have been good. But I don't know if that was true or not. So number two, I mean, as Mark said, U.S. imperialism. The U.S. has over 750 military bases around the world. Russia, with its resurgence, I think has about 5 now. They have several now that they started killing people in the Middle East. Not much. China, I think, has one on the Horn of Africa. Then China's mainly promoting its power economically at the moment, but they're building their military up like crazy. So as far as resolving this war, it's I guess, like Paul said, we're not determining that. That might be determined. The Vietnam War, to a large extent, was ended because U.S. soldiers refused to fight. So if Russian soldiers finally, and their mothers, in Russia, say, send them home. In other words, it's not going to be determined by us. This war is going to end when the people rise up against their leaders, and the Russians against the Russian leadership, and Ukrainians against the Ukrainian leadership. And, we talked something about capitalism, and I, taught history in high school, and it always amazed me how, according to top-notch historians and everything, capitalism is forever. It's like nobody really thinks that, and I was in Ferguson when this shit happened, with this racist killing and all this upsurge. And I remember this young black man saying, this whole damn system's got to go. And that's more or less what I think. Now, that's going to be a while. But, there will be an end to capitalism is not the end all. I mean, my wife and I were watching this show, The Expansion, which is like hundreds of years in the future, and it's still part of the same old capitalist shit. That's not the way history works. So I don't want to be a pessimist, but I don't, I see this war when neither side has any hope of winning anymore. And hopefully soldiers are rebelling against their own leadership. But that's as far as I can see that.
Jerry, I think that's actually beginning to happen now. I found it very interesting that in this Russian retreat, this race out of these 1,000 square miles, the Ukrainians are moving so quickly that in addition to the arms that were left behind and other things, there was also critical information left behind: maps, battle plans, other kind of intelligence that that made me feel, just that one sentence in a news story in the Wall Street Journal made me think, this is a mutiny going on, that this is their Vietnam. They've taken all these kids from Siberia and they've brought him in. He's not going to institute a draft because he doesn't want to put Mr. and Mrs. Moscow's Main Street kids into the war. So he's using these poor kids from the outer reaches of Russia, and they don't want to fight. They never did. They didn't even know why they were there. And I think that they are, you're seeing a wide scale, demoralization of the Russian army. And the only way he can cure that, Putin can cure that, is with conscription, and he can't do that because that puts regular people, you know, the Russian middle class into the war. And right now, they're not involved in the war. They're detached from the war. Just much like our country, you know, we have a professional army that the middle class that is run by legacy, basically legacy, and people looking to get a leg up in the economy. But the public is not. Public has no interest in the military anymore.
The only
You know,
thing I worried about, Mark, is that this story that you're telling is mainly coming from, you know, the Western media, the New York Times, the, you know, Washington Post, that kind of stuff. So I do believe that you know, the Russians are retreating, but they're not retreating very much in the South. Definitely not in Donbass, and you know, so there's gonna. I mean, it'd be great if, you know, soldiers were deserting everywhere or reaching across the battle lines to each other and say, you know, let's stop fighting each other. But I don't know. And of course, the problem is then the you know, who's going to be back in charge after all this shit happens? It's the same fucking billionaires that wrecked the country in the first place. So I don't know.
Boris Kargalitsky, who I keep quoting, he made an interesting point, which is a lot of Ukrainian workers are armed now. And such an armed population who, you know, for the sake of national unity, are not at the moment going to turn their guns on the Ukrainian oligarchy and have to deal with Russian invaders first. But when this is all over, there may be some kind of uprising in Ukraine. This war didn't have to happen, and one of the factors of it not happening is the Ukrainian oligarchy didn't have to play the role it played. It could have. There were lots of voices in Ukraine prior to the invasion calling for Ukrainian neutrality. Lots of voices saying, say no to NATO, declare Ukraine neutral. And the thing, the Ukrainian oligarchy didn't want to do it. And the people may get really fed up with this. Now, the same thing in Russia. As I said before, Putin's position was already precarious. And the danger in Russia is that in the situation of a collapsing Putin government, if we get there, is it a kind of more progressive democratic workers' expression of some political form that takes over? Or is it a far right? This kind of pro-American faction in the Russian elite, I don't think is going to get support from anywhere. But I think this point that the real, the war is going to end when the people of those two countries really decide it does. So, but as far as the U.S. goes, without having illusions about the American state and oligarchy who want this war to go on, is the fundamental thing. They it's clear they said it overtly. They want to bleed Russia. They want to weaken Russia.
They want to weaken
and they don't mind risking a desperate Putin and what he might do. And we should oppose that. I think Putin should be given some kind of way out, or Russia should be given some way out. I'd be happy to see Putin fall, but I do fear what comes next. So there needs to be a way out, and then there needs to be a democratic way to find out what do the people of Donbass and Crimea really want.
Great, thank you all for this really rich discussion. There was a question in the chat asking about, is there a range of opinions on this in Ukraine? I know we keep saying it's not up to us, it's up to the people of Ukraine. And I know, Mark, you talked a lot about many people you encountered in Ukraine being very for defending their country and having that nationalist view. But I'm wondering if you encountered other views when you were in Ukraine. And, obviously we have many views just on this call, not in Ukraine. So I'm wondering if any of the speakers want to touch upon some of the range of opinions and thoughts they've heard from people currently in Ukraine.
Well, I'll take that one first, because I was in circles. I would say, where I was involved with getting equipment to the military, and then dealing with people who had their homes destroyed and their lives destroyed right from the start. The people that left Ukraine, many were from the eastern area, and they believed Ukraine would win the war. They wanted Ukraine to win the war. They wanted to go home and live in a society that is actually, I know maybe they're the poorest country in Europe now, but they also have more than they had under the Soviet rule. It's crazy to hear these stories from people about how, when they were in school at Christmas time, they would get an orange. They would get an orange at Christmas time. And the food, the ability, the bountiful food that is there now, what they produce now is amazing. And in cities that were destroyed, bombed out, blackened, they have farmers markets now that have produce and meat quality as good as anything in our grocery stores. So I think that most Ukrainians feel they are living a better lifestyle now than they were under Russian rule. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the occupation of these places, and I think you've all heard this, is that in the retreat, the Russians stole everything. They're stealing coffee makers, toasters. They're taking appliances out. This isn't from Western media. This is from the people that live there. They stole everything they could to bring home, because they don't have those things. They don't have toilet seats, in a lot of places. And so I don't think anybody that I came in contact with, again, I'm in a certain wheelhouse, was even toying with the idea of being back in, being under Russian rule. People were fleeing the east. The people near the Russian border were leaving. They weren't going into Russia. They were coming all the way across the country to get out. They could have gone to Russia and been safe. I mean, I interviewed people like this. Now, of course, it's anecdotal. I didn't do a poll of 1 million people in Donbass, but after you take 30 families, who want to get out from underneath the Russian thumb and get away from the destruction, who could go to Russia and get away from the destruction, but come a few hundred miles across the country to get out. I think that speaks volumes, really.
Thank you for sure. Does anyone want to weigh in on this, Paul or Jerry, before I move on to the next question? Cool. All right, moving along then. This next question is mainly directed at Jay, or at Paul.
Jerry.
They put Jay Paul. No, I think, yes, also maybe Jerry. Range of names right now. But John Lawrence was wondering, what role did the U.S. play in creating the context of the war? And mentions that many analysts, including Chomsky, pointed out that the Biden administration made little effort to use diplomacy to avoid the war. What are your thoughts on that, as someone who works with thinkers like Chomsky and Ellsberg?
I think the evidence on the whole suggests the United States wanted the war, so they made no effort to stop it. I think they saw this as another Afghanistan, a way to suck the Russians in and take advantage of it. The thing, I'll never have to keep saying the Ukrainian oligarchy and government didn't have to go along with it. But that said, the Americans did nothing to stop it and encouraged it. No, I don't think it's as big a factor as some people on the left say it is. I don't think it was the reason Russia invaded. As I said early on, even if Ukraine did join NATO, what would it change? Even if they put the same missiles in Ukraine that they've put in some other countries, they're meaningless missiles. The missile threat to Russia is from American submarines, and it's all about the subs, and a few more missiles in Ukraine or Estonia or this or that. They're meaningless. If you're going to get into a nuclear war, the subs are going to let it loose, and it wouldn't matter if they're in Ukraine or Estonia. The objectivity of the threat to Russia was really minimal. Now, that doesn't mean subjectively it wasn't meaningful that Americans broke every promise they made about the eastward expansion of NATO. But most importantly, I think the threat of NATO, and even though the Russians don't make as big a deal about Ukraine joining EU, I think the real threat was economic. They didn't want Ukraine to be part of the Western sphere of capitalism. They wanted Ukraine to be part of the Russian sphere of capitalism. And there's, as was said earlier, there's a lot in Ukraine, from agriculture to industry to resources. It's a serious prize, and I think that's really what the fight's all about. And Putin just completely miscalculated. He thought this would be a cakewalk like Crimea was, and he'd have this enormous victory. They'd get a pro-Russian government back in. Ukraine would come back into the Russian sphere of capitalism, and la-di-da. And it was a ridiculous, crazy calculation. And he was almost naive. He didn't believe his own propaganda about the Americans. I mean, he calls the Americans all kinds of names, but he didn't actually believe it, because he should have known that the Americans don't give a shit how many Ukrainians die. So he very much misjudged the situation. So, I mean, we keep coming back, what's to be done? I saw in one of the comments, the kind of thing I'm suggesting in Ukraine, where the Ukrainian workers are going to afterwards turn their guns or force on the Ukrainian oligarchs. I don't see there actually is a movement like that there, but who knows, it might arise. The biggest question, and this is you get analytical, who knows, I don't know domestic politics well enough in Russia to know if Putin falls, what comes next. So I would just go back to what I'm repeating myself. The U.S. should not make it harder for peace negotiations to take place. And that's what they're doing now.
Thank you, Paul. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I go back to what I said in the opening, that if we wanted a resolution to this war, if we wanted this war to never happen, the Western powers would have promised NATO intervention if he invaded Ukraine, and I don't think that would have led to nuclear war. The nuclear threat. I want to ask a question of Paul, because he knows more about this than me, and he's working on these books and movies. Have you ever seen a legitimate accounting of Russia's nuclear arsenal? Because I have questions about the potency of a nuclear arsenal of a country that can't get their tanks started.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to like a guy named Matt Korda, who this is his specialty, actually studying who's got what. There's
Who's
the association. I'll have to get it for you. The
And
American.
be part of the
based in-
military industrial
Oh
complex.
God, no, 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 not at all. Quite the opposite.
Okay.
No, quite the
He's
opposite.
part of the Federation of American Scientists.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And no, they're very much in favor of, and so is he, in for example, advocating eliminating ICBMs, which are a complete are simply a target and a threat, and the most likely for miscalculation. As I said before, the real deterrents are subs, and the Russians, from what he says and Ellsberg and others I've talked to, the Russian subs are serious subs. They have very good subs, not as good as the U.S. Their anti-submarine weaponry is not as good as the U.S., but their subs are excellent. The Russian subs alone could take out most of the United States.
However, the four submarines in the Black Sea right now, and they have long-range missiles, 1,500-mile
Yeah,
missiles.
and they've got 10. They've got, I believe it is 10 ballistic missile subs in total. The Americans have 14, I think it is.
Well, the four in the Black Sea run on diesel fuel.
Yeah, I'm talking about ballistic nuclear armed weapons.
Right, I
not
understand that,
necessarily.
but those submarines run on
They're
diesel.
they're more vulnerable. They can't sit on the bottom the way
And so
nuclear.
this is sort of my point. Like there's this, I go back to my own military.
But let me just say that and that's the reason why the Russians are more dependent on their ICBMs, and certainly their mid-range missiles can take out Europe quite easily. They certainly have the capacity to wipe out Europe.
I'm not convinced, though, that everything works. I'm not convinced that their corruption hasn't bankrupted their rocket programs. And more to the point, actually, Russia's population, 40% of Russia's population lives in an area smaller than Texas. And so in a nuclear war, the West only has two targets, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and the country's destroyed. And I think that Putin, that needs to be said loudly and globally when he rattles the nuclear sword. You guys cannot win a nuclear war. You will be destroyed. Your country will be destroyed. You'll be the guy who destroyed your country. And I think Putin knows that. And I think that as nobody wants nuclear war, nobody wants nuclear proliferation, but the people that are turning the keys in the fail safes, they're not the oligarchs. They're not the guys who have $700 million yachts. They're the guys whose families live in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They're the regular guys. They're the working guys. And
Yeah.
I don't believe
I can
ever.
say that about the U.S., but
Well, there's a very interesting story, Paul, that from the 1970s, when I was in the military, that the United States did a live drill. We are firing a preemptive strike. And it was a live drill. And the people in the chain did not know. The chain was dismantled, but the people in the chain did not know it wasn't real. 50% of them did not participate.
well, it only takes the other 50, and we won't be here. I haven't talked to anyone who studies these issues who doesn't think Russia has the capacity to wipe out the United States. Now, I can't. Listen, I'm no expert. I talk to experts, but it's a hell of a speculation to roll the dice based on a hypothesis that their stuff isn't working.
Yeah.
I gotta go.
Nobody I've talked to has told me that.
Where are you going,
Gotta
Jerry?
go. Sorry,
You bored with us?
it's been swell, but yeah, gotta leave. Take care.
Thank you, Jerry.
And I have to add another thing, which is, in the big picture here, while I think the nuclear threat is real, there's another threat that's as serious and in some ways more definitive, and that is the climate crisis. And we have such a short window to deal with it. And if there isn't some kind of collaboration with China and Russia, the United States, Europe, on climate, we're totally screwed, and in a much shorter time frame than anybody thought. Like, you know, we're hitting 1.5 by mid 2030s, and maybe even by early 2030s. And once we hit 1.5, and the way we're going, where there's nothing serious happening almost anywhere, we're on our way to 2. And when you get to 2, you're on your way to 3. I mean, we're within a decade or two of tens of millions of people living in the southern hemisphere having to go north. So nobody's even talking about what's going to happen when the majority of the population of the world has to move north. This situation's got to get resolved in Ukraine. And I know me saying it ain't going to mean diddly squat. But that's the pressure we have to put on the American elites. And instead of the American elites being alarmed, a large section of the American elites are sinking into outright support for fascism. You know, they go, never mind go defend democracy in Ukraine. They can't bloody defend even the most facade of democracy in the United States. And who knows what's going to come in 2022 and 2024. So we got to, you know, when we're talking to ordinary people in the United States and workers, we got to stress the urgent global danger here and look at the Ukraine thing in the context of that.
Thank you both. I know Jerry had to go. There's just a couple more points I wanted to touch on if you both have a couple more minutes. There's been a lot of different comments in the chat kind of pointing out the hypocrisy of the US, talking about the US trying to make other countries do anything, given our track record and just ongoing militarism and violence that we tend to inflict in the world. And I know there was a comment early on, I think from John, saying that he believes that there should be a neutral arbiter for these conflicts, something like the UN or governance. And I'm wondering what you both think of that. Like, I know there are many people who completely agree and believe that, you know, Ukraine has the right to defend themselves militarily with weapons, but maybe those shouldn't be coming directly from the US. Maybe there should be another arbiter given our role in the geopolitical sphere. And I'm wondering what you both think of that. Yeah, please respond.
Well, we have one, and nobody listens to them. You know, I mean, the UN is supposed to, that's what the UN job is supposed to do, you know, to be the arbiter, to find solutions, and nobody cares. Nobody listens to them. You again, I go back to the same thing. You know, you sometimes, you know, you can't negotiate with force when force is on the move. You know, it's just we're a flawed species. You know, I mean, you know, we're a flawed species. You're asking for reason. You're asking for reason from an animal that is, you know, territorial, predatory, greedy. You know, and so what do you do? Like, you know, we've tried this, you know, it's been tried to bring peace to, you know, in over centuries of time. Like, how do you find peace? How do you get peace when there's always somebody that wants more, and they're going to step over the line to get it, and you're not going to negotiate with them. You know, in the last 100 years, we've seen it, you know, and to me, this whole thing in Ukraine is the way this was handled. It almost created like another Hitler-esque environment. Say Ukraine rolled over. I can tell you, I think, from being there, if Ukraine rolled over, and by the way, and if Russia advances on Kyiv, I believe Poland will break with NATO and get in the war, because their fear of Russia and their lack of confidence in Germany, France, United States, Britain. Actually, they're most confident about Britain, but the other Western powers defending them, none, zero. They think they know that they're on their own because they've been there before. They've been sold down the river by the West, first to Hitler and then to Stalin. And so when you deal with somebody that comes out and says, we want to restore the Soviet Union, when somebody says there are no Ukrainians and there is no Ukraine, which is what the Russian defense minister said. Putin said, I want to restore the Soviet Union. The only thing you can do at that point is either give up a country that doesn't want to be given up and then create years and years and years of strife. I'll tell you something really interesting. So we're in, I leave Ukraine and I go to Hungary, Budapest, and touring Europe a little bit. And in their big palatial parliament buildings, there's an exhibit of 1956. Same stuff. Russian tanks firing on civilians. Russian tanks blowing up, people's private homes, innocent people. Same stuff. It was like the pictures out of Ukraine, except they were in black and white. And so when you have these kind of, predatory movements, I just think that, somebody's got to be a good guy and somebody's got to be a bad guy. Everybody's kind of a little bit of both. But the guy that steps over the line into the sovereign nation, the guy who begins the fight, is the guy that the world needs to turn on. And I think that's what's happened here. I can't agree more with Paul about how our country, and I believed it from the start, I said it to open the show, we did not want this war to end in a diplomatic way with the threat of military intervention, with arming Ukraine immediately. One of the things that President Biden said, that irritated me to no end was we knew they were going to do this in November. Well, then why weren't you sending the weapons then? Why weren't you putting in the sanctions then? Why weren't you warning Putin then, you're crossing a line that is going to be bad for everybody? Why did we wait until 3 months into the war? And the West, by the way, this needs to be said. The West did not do anything militarily to help Ukraine until the Ukrainians punched the bully in the nose and sent him home crying from the schoolyard. And that's when the West jumped into the war. So I think the West was actually kind of hoping Ukraine would just roll over. And the Ukrainian bravery in defeating Russia and pushing them out of Kyiv with no help from the West. None. If you go back over the history of it, we don't want to provoke Putin. Joe Biden pulled our military advisors and trainers out of Ukraine. We wouldn't give Poland the jets so they could give the MiGs to Ukraine, all in the beginning of the war. So, yeah, I think that it's calculated on our defense industry's part to say, let's let this thing play out for a few months. 100,000 civilians die, a couple towns get destroyed, but then we can start producing again to send them stuff and then restock our stuff and restock the other countries. It's a very insidious view of the world, but I believe it 100%. And I'm a military veteran. I'm a patriot, and I believe it 100%. And I've known it for forever. This is our post-World War II. Eisenhower warned about it, and here we are.
Thanks, Mark. I'll let Paul respond, and then I see Debbie and Dave have their hand up, and I'd like to get them in.
I don't think there's a human nature. I think there's two systems. There's an old capitalist system that's hanging around a hell of a lot longer than anybody thought it would. And it has its nature. And there's a psychology based on private property and greed and wealth and power that gives rise to a nature. And most people don't have wealth and power, and it's not really their nature, but they certainly can be brought into the culture of that. And there's also excellent evidence, thousands of years, and certainly of oppressed people fighting and sacrificing and organizing and gaining victories. And including, even to what extent there is a democracy. It's because ordinary people fought for it. It's not because any of the elites wanted it. And so let me get this back to then, what do we need to do about all this? Well, there's elections coming up. This kind of global capitalism I've called a cancer, but cancers can have malignant tumors. And the cancer of global capitalism, there's a malignant tumor in the United States and quite a few other countries. And this rise of kind of Christian nationalist authoritarianism. It's a malignant tumor that if it takes power in the United States, forget any action on climate. And these people want, if not actual war with China, almost war with China, and maybe actual war. So the immediate issue in the United States is we have to focus on the 2022 elections and trying to elect progressives at every bloody level. I saw some kid, just a progressive kid, 18 years old, just won, I think it was a school board in Idaho, beat a far-right Republican. The focus right now needs to be on defeating corporate Democrats wherever they can, and then if you have to hold your nose and vote for a corporate Democrat to defeat a far-right fascistic Christian nationalist Republican, it has to be done. And the key to this, and there's one very important thing happening, and this, if you want a note of optimism to come near the end here, the American working class was severely weakened by globalization. The ability of capital to use cheap labor, especially from China and other places, to weaken American unions significantly almost broke the backbone of American unions. Well, you can thank the pandemic because the faith in the whole global supply chain is now up in the air. The ability to, and I just was reading an article in The Economist where they said the ability to use global labor markets to have labor flexibility, which means force Americans into cheap labor. It's all up in doubt now. American workers haven't had this kind of leverage since maybe, the 1960s or something, maybe more. The ability, and this almost railroad strike. I mean, I know unionization is down, but there's still unionization in key sectors of the economy. And just imagine if the railroad workers also had some political demands that went with those economic demands. What did they get, like a 25% wage increase? I mean, I don't know enough about the details, but that sounds like a real victory. And they rejected the contract of their own union leaders to get there. We need to focus on talking to ordinary people and knocking on doors. As much as I do media, I don't think media is all that effective to get the people that don't already agree with you, because everyone's watching media with people they agree with. You got to knock on doors and talk to people that don't agree with us. But there's an opportunity here, the objective opportunity, which workers actually have some leverage now. And boy, is it time to start getting organized with progressive demands, including on foreign policy. I mean, the obvious one on military. Why do some people get rich and others die in American wars? I mean, it's such a no-brainer. But we're not talking to ordinary people in the states that supply most of the soldiers.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Debbie and Dave?
Yeah, first of all, I want to apologize because I advertised this as an open forum, and I think it's been too much, people haven't been able to get him make statements. And our future Zooms, if I have anything to do with them, that's what they got to be. I'm sorry. But I'd like to say that don't vote Democratic. Don't vote Republican. Neither one is going to make a difference. You're voting for the big fascists, the finance capital. That's the Democrats. They're the ones who are pro-war as much or more than the Republicans. Neither one is any different. When you say you hold your nose, you hold your nose. And remember when everybody held their nose and voted for Johnson over Goldwater, who increased in Vietnam. Mark, you're too young for that. You're also too young to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, or you'd be a lot more scared about nuclear war.
I'm
And the
60
one country,
I'm 65, Dave.
shut
Dave,
up.
I'm
My
65.
turn now.
I'm
The
just telling
one country that would have used nuclear weapons is the U.S.
And they killed 180,000
80,000 people.
Japanese people.
And they threatened to use them again and again in the world. They went in negotiations and said it. So to think that you can vote for one good side, and this is just like World War I. The U.S. government, the U.S. capitalists are scared. They're weaker, but they have the most weapons now. The other countries are growing, their economies are growing, and China and Russia are accumulating, the other two big imperialist powers. What happened in World War I? The workers had a revolution in many countries, and in Russia particularly. So workers can stand up and fight back.
And that's the only hope.
And that's the only hope we have. We don't have any hope of electing a good Democrat because they turn as soon as they get elected. And not one of them is opposed to the NATO and has spoken out against it. Our one person I thought was progressive here was asked about NATO and wouldn't answer. Okay, so there's no hope in that. And the only hope is that workers organize and that they do it. In Vietnam, 1,000, according to the Wall Street Journal, 1,000 officers were shot and fragged by their own troops.
And that may
happen in Russia. 1,000 officers. And part of that, but the other thing that ended the Vietnam War was the NLF. But I take, and so do my friends who organized with the military and my people I know who went into the military to help stop that war. But that's the only hope we have. And no, Mark, no side is good. Not the capitalists anywhere, but we can be changed. We don't have to rely on them forever. Because otherwise, and that's more than that will make global warming and climate change even worse if the capitalists stay in power all over.
That's what's happening.
Great. Thank you, Debbie and Dave. And I apologize, there was not more open discussion. I was not clear that it was a forum and that was what I was supposed to be doing. But in these last few moments, does anyone else want to chime in?
Well, I want to say it.
I said it.
Say it again. They didn't hear you.
Capitalism's got to go.
I don't think anyone disagrees here with that. But the how is the question.
This is Jack.
There'll never be elections.
Sorry, I think someone's trying to speak who's joining on the phone.
I'm on the phone, yes. I have a question. Back, I think it was said earlier in the discussion that back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was an opportunity for Russia to become more westernized, possibly to join with NATO. I think that was the goal originally. And if had Russia and NATO, Georgia, had a timetable to join NATO, if everybody's in the same club, would that have to me, it seems obvious it would have prevented this war from happening. And I'm also a naval veteran from the early 1970s, from Vietnam and all. So to me, anything to prevent a war, had Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia all been part of NATO as NATO expanded eastward. In other words, had there been a timetable for Russia and Ukraine to join NATO together, This
Well,
war
I
never
don't-
would have.
Sorry, I'm sorry if you're not finished. Go ahead.
Yes, I was just saying, I believe this war never would have happened if members
Yeah,
of the same club.
I don't think there'd be any point to a NATO if Russia joined a NATO. Listen, what was NATO's primary mission? To suppress
stop Ru-
socialism in
Stop-
Europe.
stop-
To suppress socialism in Western Europe. The primary mission was to make sure that the Europe that gets reconstructed after World War II is in the American sphere of capitalism. That was the mission of NATO. It was very clear, and this I learned from Ellsberg, but other sources as well, very early on, like in 1960 when Kennedy was talking about the missile gap, and the Air Force was claiming that the Soviet Union had 1,000 ICBMs when the US had maybe 40. It turned out it was all bullshit. In fact, the Soviet Union had 4 ICBMs. And Kennedy knew it and kept talking about the missile gap. So I think what Mark said earlier, but they kept exaggerating the threat to build up the military industrial complex. But jump ahead. So there never really was a threat. There never needed to be a NATO. It was clear that Soviet Union was in a defensive posture. There was never a plan of any seriousness. There may have been something on paper, but it was BS. There was never a serious plan for the Soviet Union to go west of what was already within the Soviet Union. And the Americans knew it. NATO was there to deal, to make sure the communists didn't come to power in Greece, to make sure Franco stayed in power in Spain, and you had a fascist in Portugal, and to interfere in the Italian elections. It was a way, maybe the most important thing. Reconstructed Europe would buy American weapons. The extent to which foreign policy is driven by arms sale, you cannot exaggerate it. And who became the biggest competitor to the Americans in arms sale? Well, who's number 2 in the world now? Russia. So the competition over arms sales is a very important factor, even in terms of this Ukraine situation. And mind you, Ukraine was a big arms exporter too, and competitor to Russia. So there's a whole nother complexity here. But if you go back to that period, if Russia had been allowed to join the EU, if Russia had been allowed to be part of the Western capitalist system as a major player, which it would be, especially because of the fossil fuel leverage, yeah, I think this would be a different world. But then it wouldn't be a capitalist world because it ain't the way capitalist monopolies work. It would have been rational, but this system ain't rational.
So you think Russia as part of the European Union certainly would have made a difference?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there would have been a kind of economic integration, and Russia would have been a major player if it was allowed to grow that way. But it wasn't just the United States didn't want that. Germany didn't want it, for not only for competitive reasons, and that's a very important thing, but the whole history of Russia and Germany, filled with problems. So, but the underlying thing is that German monopolies, German banking, didn't want any serious competition in Europe because the German banks are the dominant, force in Europe.
Yeah, because Russia did ask, Putin did ask in 2001, when are we going to join NATO?
Yeah, well, I know he did, but I wouldn't see what. I'm sure NATO thought, what's the point of NATO if we let him in? How do you justify all these aircraft carriers if Russia's in NATO? I mean, what would be the point of all that shit? You can't sell the American people on such weaponry if your primary existential enemy is in NATO.
Yeah, but now we have Russia and China aligned, which is a pretty formidable power.
Well, it's a mixed bag. Boeing's a great story. In Taiwan is an important market for Boeing weapons. Not in the top 8 or 9, but I think in the top 20 certainly, but billions of dollars. But who's the number 1 purchaser of Boeing commercial aircraft, at least in 2020, the last numbers I saw? China. So the same company benefits from almost war over Taiwan, but still wants to keep commercial relations with China so they can sell them commercial aircraft. This system is not rational. It's filled with these kinds of contradictions because it's chaotic. The system's chaos. There's not some great master plan here running everything. They're trying to keep a chaotic system that's always on the edge of an economic catastrophe. They're trying to keep that under control, quote unquote, but always with the primary objective of maximizing profits for billionaires. And that's the heart of the problem, because that doesn't work. It ain't rational to run a world based on maximizing profits for billionaires. It has to constantly spiral out of control into war and into total paralysis in dealing with the climate threat. But how do we get this message to ordinary workers? That's the question.
That is certainly the question. We are just about over time. I feel like we've had some really rich discussion tonight, both speaking and in the chat. So I appreciate everyone for their participation. Maybe if you each want to give like 30-second wrap-ups, like really, really brief so we can close out, that would be great. Mark, you're muted.
All right. Well, I go back to for me, this is these greater global issues and things that we are talking about tonight about how do we change the entire world is obviously very important, but the immediacy of the suffering of the people in Ukraine must be dealt with, now. This is enormously destructive. Russia, we say there's no bad guys, there's no good guys, whatever, but Russia's war mentality is scorched earth. They are destroying cities. They are blowing up farm towns that have no strategic use. They are committing barbaric violations of human rights, rape, torture, murder of civilians. This isn't made up. This isn't some Western media invention, because I've seen it with my own two eyes. People on the road from Chernihiv to Kyiv, everything was destroyed. They blew up every gas station. They blew up every village they could get their hands on. No strategic importance. It's just like this insane vandalism with huge weapons. And so while those issues that we're talking about here, the umbrella issues are of great importance. We can't forget the little people. We're talking about workers should do this, workers should unite, workers should. Who do you think's getting killed over there? The farmers, the people in apartment buildings that work in the postal service and run the trains. That's who's getting killed over there. And so this scorched earth carpet destruction, is something that needs to be stopped. And whether it's through some negotiations or meeting that violence with violence, which is unfortunate, I think that really is paramount to any discussion. Humanity first, in the immediate, and everything else is second.
Well, I've already spoken to that point, so let me just quickly add one other point. There is something the U.S. government could do And I don't want to minimize the destruction and devastation of Ukraine in any way. But there is a war that the United States could affect very directly, relatively quickly, and which Biden promised to do, and that's Yemen. And the United States could, instead of Biden going to Saudi Arabia and kissing the king's ass, the U.S. could seriously threaten Saudi interests and do something about the Yemen war. Moreover, Biden promised to do it in the election. He was elected. That was one of his campaign planks, that he would do that. And he didn't, and quite the contrary. Why? Because he wants the Saudis totally in the American camp and not in any way talking to the Chinese. So I think while the Ukraine situation is incredibly urgent, so is the war in Yemen, and a lot of people need to also be putting pressure on the U.S. government on that. Anyway, this is a big conversation, and we can go on, but we're near the end. So I'll just do a plug for the analysis.news. That's where people can find what I'm doing. And someday, in a year or so, maybe we'll see that film. The name of the film I'm working on with Ellsberg is How to Stop a Nuclear War.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, for raising up Yemen as well. I know we've been working on work trying to stop the U.S. involvement in Yemen for at least 5 years at this point, and we've seen us come very close and still fail to do so. So let's hope we can end as many wars as possible. And thank you both again, Mark and Paul and Jerry, who's already left, for being with us tonight. And
Thanks for having us.
PASI for
Thank
having
you.
this webinar tonight. So thank you so
Thanks,
much, everyone.
thanks to everybody.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.